Down in a hidden cut of the Smokies where the light turns honey thick, I once saw a slab of gray stone shine like glass. Pine breath hung in the air. 3 narrow shapes stood nearby, pale and rigid as knuckles, and the shine, whatever it was, caught the morning sun and threw it back at us like a held breath. I remember the forest going quiet the way a church does just before someone says a name. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Before that day in the ravine, my life followed a clean, ordinary rhythm. I'd stepped off the force a few years earlier, traded night shifts for yard work, early coffee, and Sunday suppers. Sevier County in the fall is an easy place to love maples turning to ember ridge lines, smudged blue mornings right around 59 degrees, with a thin mist laying low in the fields. If I cracked my kitchen window before dawn, I could hear the highway hum to the park, a distant rush that never quite stops, even when everything else in town is asleep. I lived 2 doors down from the Fosters on a quiet street, where tires whispered against fallen leaves and porch lights clicked on like clockwork. Their place was a single-story ranch, with a deep eave and a bird feeder that drove the squirrels half mad. David worked second shift at the machine shop over in Alcoa. Sarah kept the books at the elementary school. Steady hands, soft voice, the sort of woman who made sure every kid had a pencil come test day. They were tidy people, the kind who rolled trash cans to the curb at the same spot every Thursday and left the lid facing the street. Not fussy, just neat, as if order could keep the world in line. Caroline was their only child. She had one of those quick, interested faces. She'd turn her head when you spoke to her like a bird listening. Botany was her thing. She carried a little field guide that wore down at the edges and a camera strap polished smooth against her shoulder. If you saw her at the curb, she'd have a stub of a pencil tucked behind one ear and mud on her shoelaces, happy about it. When other kids talked, fall weekends, football parties, tailgates, Caroline talked trailheads, mushrooms under poplars, the way limestone cuts a creek bed. She wasn't a show-off. She just loved the hills like they were a language she was getting fluent in. That Friday started like any other good Tennessee Friday in October, cool, bright, and honest. I was out early rolling a hose back into a loop when their front door opened and the 3 of them came onto the porch in the kind of tumble you get when a grown child still lives at home. Sarah had a plate and a dish towel, steam curling where the cloth didn't cover it. Caroline was in dark hiking pants boots planted easy on the step, braiding her hair fast without looking the way you do when the hands know what the mind hasn't caught up to yet. David was pretending not to worry. Men of his generation are experts at that. He lifted his chin at me. "Morning, Dan," he said. "Morning," I said back and lifted the hose as if it were a salute. You measure a neighborhood by its small talk. Ours ran on simple fuel weather miles supper. The mountains looked close that morning, like you could reach the first ridge with a firm walk. Caroline told them she'd be back by dinner. It wasn't a pledge. It was just what people said on days like that: be back by dinner, pick something up off the highway, don't forget the porch light. She hugged her mom without making a show of it, then slipped her field guide and that little camera into the passenger seat of her dark green Civic. The car's paint had a dull sheen to it from the dust and the low sun, nothing remarkable. The engine turned over in a patient way, like it trusted the day to cooperate. I went inside and poured fresh coffee. The radio sat next to the sink, old habit from patrol days, and I kept it low enough that I could hear my own thoughts. There's a comfort to routine that doesn't get enough praise: a clean mug, a quiet kitchen, the sound of a neighbor's car rolling out toward the highway. The Smokies were having one of those clear stretches where a cold front scrubs the air and the sky stands hard and blue over the ridges. I had a list on the table: pay the water bill, tighten the gate hinge call. Walt back about that carburetor and a pencil mark next to each chore like mile markers on an easy road. Around 9, the sun had found the yard full on, and the maple at the street was letting go of leaves in slow motion. Sarah called across the side yard fence to tell me the school fundraiser had gone well, and if I wanted jars of strawberry jam at $2 each, I'd better claim them early. We made neighbor talk for 5 minutes where the good apples were this year, whether the deer were coming lower at night. Then she went back in with her hands tucked under her elbows. The house smelled like toast when the wind shifted. Sometimes you can smell a home's seasons even from outside. Fall in the Foster's kitchen was buttered bread and a hint of cinnamon, the sort of scent that makes you certain life is going to remain exactly as it is. At 9:15, the phone rang in their place. I didn't hear the words, only the tone, Sarah's voice rising into that brisk, cheerful rhythm she used when she was not trying to worry anyone. Afterward, she stepped onto the porch with the handset still in her fingers and looked down the street as if she could see the mountain from there. She caught my eye and gave a little nod the all-clear neighbors share. "Made it fine," she said, then added, almost to herself, parking wasn't bad. I kept my day moving the way a day wants to move. I cleaned the truck bed of old cardboard, walked the fence line, and pulled a stubborn root that had gotten bold under the downspout. Around 11, I noticed David's pickup had returned. He'd slept a few hours after night shift and sat in his garage with the door-up radio mumbling a ball game from last week. He had a socket set laid out on a towel and wasn't touching any of it, just looking. Men like David pretend to rest by sitting with a project they don't intend to finish. He glanced up when I walked by and said he might grill chicken later if the wind stayed gentle. I said that sounded good and waved it off like I didn't want to invite myself. By early afternoon, Knoxville's rhythm changes. The city breathes in for the weekend. You can feel it even out our way. Mailboxes latching dogs in the next block getting a little talkative. The school buses easing toward 4 o'clock. Around 3 clouds the size of parade floats drifted up from the southwest but couldn't get organized. The air stayed crisp. If you were headed to Alum Cave on a day like that, you'd track a comfortable pace trailhead at 5,000 feet of air that tastes like stone, and Chlorophyll Creek chatter on your left. Most of the climb wooden footbridges that flex a little under your boots. It isn't a hard trail for a practiced hiker. It feels friendly tourists with cameras, college kids with day packs, retirees in clean sneakers testing the grade. I know that terrain the way I know the roads to church. The first half mile is a good place to settle your breathing. If you're careful, you notice how the light shifts from silver to green as hemlock shadow deepens. Every so often, a raven drops a comment from the high limbs and you look up without meaning to. There's grace in that quiet. It's the kind of place Caroline understood. She used to tell me the slopes were classrooms, if you listened the lichens mapping air quality, the sedges grading the season week by week. Around 4:30 I saw Sarah placing 2 potatoes on the counter through their kitchen window, then 3. It's a detail that sticks with me. She wasn't counting. She was just moving on autopilot, adding 1 more without noticing. In houses like ours, dinner is as much sound as taste cabinet doors oven tick the faint hiss when a pan meets heat. The porch light usually clicked on around dusk. That day, it came on early, a soft square of yellow pooling on the concrete, a message to no one in particular that the house was ready to receive. The first faint crack in the day, so small you could miss it, was how quiet David got after he checked the clock. He stood in the doorway between kitchen and garage, hands empty, and looked at the phone like it was something he ought to polish. I was on my porch steps lacing up work boots I didn't need anymore, the leather still creasing the same way it did when I wore a badge. Old muscles remember even when the job is gone. From that spot, you can see the bend in our street, and beyond it, the taller trees that hint at the ridge. He gave me a tight smile and ducked back inside. By 5:30, the neighborhood settled into its evening patterned screen doors, a mower finally giving up a television laugh track escaping someone's den. I hosed off a shovel and tried not to look at the Foster's drive. There's a rule in places like ours, let folks be. If they need something, they'll come get you. Around 6, the mail carrier was late, and that felt like a small nudge from the world, the kind no one can argue with. Sarah turned on the radio low, the way you do when you'd like a voice in the room that isn't your own. I remember the smell of dinner on the air-grilled meat from 2 houses over, onions catching sweet in a pan somewhere nearby. I remember a kid's basketball thumping 3 doors down, the rhythm steady until it skittered into a bush and the kid laughed to himself. It's odd what the mind protects and what it serves back to you later with crystal clarity. I can still see the thin line of dusk ink its way across the street, how the maple leaves fluttered without sound, just falling and falling as if their only job was to take up space, while the rest of us waited for something we couldn't name. At 6:30, Sarah stepped onto their porch and stood in the amber wash of the light. She wasn't pacing. She was just present the way a lighthouse is present. I lifted a hand from my stoop, and she lifted hers back, and that's the last simple thing I remember about that evening. In our little corner of Knoxville, twilight is when the day decides who made it home and who didn't. You don't think like that on most nights. You just know it. A little after dark, David pulled the screen door open and let it ease shut behind him. He stood with his arms crossed, not defensive, just trying to keep the chill off. I watched him look up the street, then past the street, past the houses and the tree line to where the road becomes curves, and the curves become mountains. I told myself she'd be along any minute. People say that even when they don't mean to. That's the quiet I carry the early part, before words, before decisions. The potatoes were done. The porch light burned a little warmer against the glass. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing. The clock slid past 7, and the night laid itself down over our block like a blanket someone had shaken from too high up, drifting, then settling. And the street, that easy little street of ours, stayed empty longer than it should have. The phone on their kitchen wall stayed still. The headlights that usually swung around the bend never touched the maple trunk. By 8, the porch light felt too bright for the hour, as if it were asking a question the night had no intention of answering. By the time the clock touched 8 that night, the stillness around the Foster house had grown heavy. Their porch light cut a warm square onto the driveway, but no car pulled in to claim it. I sat on my front step with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the way the glow pooled against the asphalt. In a neighborhood like ours, that kind of silence starts to feel alive after a while, like it's holding its breath with you. Around 9, I saw the outline of David through their window, just standing by the phone, not moving the receiver still on the hook. I remember thinking he was probably waiting for that familiar sound, the quick lift, before Caroline's voice came through bright and apologetic, explaining she'd lost track of time. But it didn't come. And when the hours stretched past 10, the silence started to sound wrong. I walked over, told them I could call one of the rangers I knew up in Sevier County just to check the lot at Alum Cave. Sarah nodded without looking up. She had that look people get when they're trying to keep fear inside their chest where it can't make a scene. I made the call around 10:30. The ranger on night shift was a young guy named Ellis who'd joined the Park Service after I retired. He was quick to act, said he'd send a patrol to sweep the trailhead and check for Caroline's car. I could hear him writing things down: the make, the color, the plate number. When he asked if she was experienced, I told him yes, more than most. Then she knows how to stay safe, he said. It was meant to reassure me, but it didn't take. At that hour, reassurance feels thin. It doesn't fill the air the way it should. By 11, the 3 of us were sitting in the living room. The TV was on with the volume turned down low, just enough to light the room without drawing attention to itself. Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers restless against each other. David had gone quiet like a man stuck between disbelief and something worse. I told them I'd drive up first thing in the morning, meet the search crew, make sure the right people were handling it. We didn't talk much after that. Sometimes the best thing you can do for people is sit there and not pretend to fix what can't be fixed yet. When I finally walked home, the night was cool and still, the kind of air that smells faintly of pine and ash. I left my porch light off for the first time in years. It felt wrong to shine any light when theirs was still burning. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed a thermos, a flashlight, and a pair of old boots that had seen more search lines than I cared to count. The drive up to the park entrance took just under an hour and a half. The sun hadn't fully cleared the ridges yet, and the road cut through a valley that still held a low silver fog. When I reached the gate at Alum Cave Trail, 2 park vehicles were parked near the tree line. I spotted Ellis near the lot, writing in his logbook. He saw me, nodded, and pointed toward a dark green Civic. Even from a distance, I knew it was hers. The car was locked, no signs of damage. Inside on the passenger seat sat her backpack and her phone. A little camera strap curled around the edge of the bag like it had been dropped there gently. I bent close to the window and saw a bottle of water and a guidebook tucked halfway out of the zipper. I've seen a lot of strange things in my life, but that moment froze me. It wasn't dramatic, no blood, no struggle, no mess, just the eerie wrongness of what was left behind. For a hiker like Caroline, that backpack was her lifeline. Leaving it was like leaving behind your pulse. We waited until sunrise before making a formal call to initiate a search. I knew the protocol well enough. Start small, expand fast. By 8 that morning, teams were forming at the ranger station. By noon, over 100 people had joined, a mix of park staff deputies and local volunteers. Helicopters circled the upper ridges, K9 units worked the base of the trail, and searchers fanned out in measured lines calling her name through the trees. You could hear those voices echoing for miles, and each echo made the mountains sound bigger, emptier. I joined a small group that took the lower path along the creek. Every so often, one of us would stop, lean down, and point to a footprint that turned out to be a boot print from another hiker, or just the shape of a fallen leaf. Hope can make you see patterns where none exist. The dogs caught her scent a few times near the car, but lost it a short distance in. That was troubling. If she'd walked far, the dogs would have tracked her longer. If they couldn't, it meant she might never have gone past that first stretch of trail. But that didn't make sense either. People don't vanish before they start walking. They leave clues, broken twigs, fabric, a trail of thought. Caroline had left nothing. Over the next 2 days, the operation grew. Helicopters scanned ravines that swallowed daylight whole, and volunteers combed through brush so thick you had to crawl on your hands. Every evening, we'd regroup at the ranger station, faces gray with exhaustion and mud up to our knees. And every night ended the same way, with no answers. By the 4th day, news crews had arrived from Knoxville and Asheville. They filmed the trailhead, the volunteers, the rows of parked trucks, and they aired interviews with anyone willing to speak. Sarah and David stood in front of the cameras once. Sarah's voice was barely audible. David didn't say anything at all. I stayed out of frame, though they caught a glimpse of me once behind the tape line. I never liked cameras on scenes like that. They take something sacred and flatten it. By the end of the 2nd week, the official search wound down. The weather was turning colder. Resources stretched thin. The Park Service moved its focus to maintenance, posting signs, cataloging evidence, keeping records tidy for a case that had nowhere left to go. I watched as the last K9 unit left the lot, the handler patting his dog like a soldier saying goodbye to a comrade. When they shut down the command tent, the silence that followed felt heavier than the search itself. I stayed close to the Fosters in the months that followed. Their porch light still came on every night, same as before, but it had a different meaning now. It wasn't habit, it was hope, stubborn and small. Sarah took to keeping Caroline's room exactly as she'd left it. Books stacked by the window camera on the desk, half a roll of film inside. She told me once that she couldn't bring herself to develop it. If I see what she saw last, she said, then it means that's where she stayed. David worked longer shifts, the kind of hours meant to keep a man from thinking. But no matter how much time passed, that car in the parking lot stayed in my mind, sealed behind the glass like a warning. A year passed, then another half. The case cooled like all of them eventually do when there's nothing left to chase. Flyers faded in store windows. The rangers moved on to new calls. Even the locals, the ones who'd helped us search, stopped bringing her up unless someone mentioned the old case files from the Smokies. That's what happens in small towns. The ground covers what time can't. But I couldn't shake it. I'd driven those mountain roads for decades, and I knew every turn, every blind corner. You don't just lose a person in a park that well-worn, unless someone wanted them lost. When spring rolled back around, the Fosters hosted a memorial. It wasn't a funeral, they still refused to use that word, but a gathering. Family, friends, old classmates. They set up folding chairs in the backyard, and the scent of lilacs carried through the air. People told stories about her curiosity, her laugh, the way she'd stop mid-hike to take pictures of moss because the smallest things deserve attention. I stood by the fence, hands in my pockets, feeling that same emptiness you get when a case file closes without a name. When it ended, Sarah thanked everyone. David just stared past the crowd toward the mountains. His eyes didn't look angry or broken. They looked like someone still listening for a voice on the wind. Months later, when I'd mostly convinced myself that chapter was closed, something started to shift. It wasn't a call or a headline, just a feeling, the kind that wakes you in the middle of the night without a sound. Sometimes, after years on the job, you learn to trust those quiet instincts. Around that time, a few of the old search volunteers started talking again, wondering about trails we hadn't checked, caves that weren't on the map. I remember telling them, if there's a place we missed, it's because it wasn't meant to be found. I said it half joking, but the words stayed with me longer than I expected. By the summer of 2000, nearly 2 years after she'd vanished, I got a call from an old ranger friend named Miles. He didn't say much over the line, just asked if I could come by the office in Sevierville. His tone was careful, and that alone told me everything I needed to know. Something had been found. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the low hum of voices, a kind of restrained energy that always precedes bad news. When I asked him where, he hesitated before answering. "Off trail," he said. "Farther out than anyone had reason to go." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the map spread open, tracing my finger along the ridges north of Alum Cave. My coffee had gone cold again, same as the first night she didn't come home. The house creaked softly around me, and the wind outside sounded like a low breath dragging across the valley. Somewhere out there, deep in those woods, the mountains had finally decided to give something back. What it was, I didn't know yet. But I remember the way the map's paper smelled faintly of dust and ink, and how the folds lined up perfectly to the spot where the light hit it, right where the trail should have ended and where the nightmare was about to begin again. When the call came that evening, the tone in Miles's voice told me this wasn't a recovery, it was something stranger. He didn't offer much detail, just asked me to meet him out near the park boundary before first light. Said they'd found something in a ravine deep off trail, a place that wasn't on any map. By the time I pulled up, fog was rolling down through the trees in sheets. The air smelled wet metallic, almost like the inside of a cave. I followed the trail of tire tracks until I saw the cluster of government trucks, their floodlights cutting pale cones through the mist. The whole area was quiet, except for the low hum of a generator and the sound of boots sinking into soft ground. I knew that kind of silence. It wasn't shock, it was reverence, the hush that settles over a place when everyone realizes they've crossed into something they don't fully understand. Miles met me halfway down the embankment. He looked older than I remembered, like the night itself had aged him. He didn't speak right away, just handed me a pair of latex gloves and nodded for me to follow. The path was slick and narrow, lined with roots that twisted like rope underfoot. Then, as we turned into the ravine, the trees opened up, and there it was, the altar. I stopped cold. 4 heavy logs formed a base, and on top of them rested a broad slab of gray stone, smoothed unnaturally clean. But what caught my breath wasn't the stone, it was what lay sealed inside the amber-like mass on top of it. At first, I thought it was glass catching the light, until I realized it was resin thick and golden hard as rock in some places, translucent in others. Beneath it, a figure perfectly still, perfectly preserved. The body of a young woman, hands folded on her chest, head turned slightly to one side. Even through the layers, I could make out the shape of her clothes. I didn't say anything for a long time. Miles finally broke the silence. "They found her yesterday," he said quietly. 3 cavers from Knoxville. Thought they'd stumbled onto an old mining site." He pointed toward a cluster of flagged markers around the perimeter bone candlesticks, each carved by hand, set into the dirt with ritual precision. I could feel the chill climb through me, not from the cold, but from the stillness of it all. The way the forest seemed to hold its breath, the smell of pine thick and resinous, the sound of insects fading as if the woods themselves refused to disturb the scene. We didn't get close that first hour. Nobody wanted to rush it. Photographers documented every inch the altar, the ground, even the carved crosses etched into the nearby trees. When I brushed my hand against one of the trunks, I could feel the faint scar under the bark. It wasn't recent. Whoever had made those marks had done it months, maybe years ago. They surrounded the site like sentinels. I remember thinking this wasn't just where the body had been placed, it was where someone had been coming back again and again to tend to it. By late afternoon, a team from the forensic unit arrived with rigging equipment. The plan was to remove the entire slab, intact body and all. The resin had fused to the stones so tightly that any attempt to separate them would have destroyed evidence. Moving something that heavy through the woods was slow, brutal work. They cut a narrow path through the rhododendron setting, winches inching the slab up the slope 1 foot at a time. The sound of the cables groaning echoed like something alive. It took 8 of us until nearly dark to reach the service road. When we finally slid it onto the transport stretcher, everyone stood back in silence. Nobody spoke her name aloud yet, but we all knew. You could see it in their eyes, the quiet recognition that after all these years, Caroline Foster had come home, but not in the way anyone prayed for. The next morning, I drove to the forensic center in Knoxville. I'd been in that building plenty of times, but that day it felt foreign sterile in a way that didn't comfort. Through the observation window, I watched as the pathologists examined the resin cocoon. It glowed faintly under the lab lights, its surface rippling with trapped air bubbles and streaks of sap. They took scans, first X-rays imaging before they even touched it. You could see her bones, every delicate line of her jaw, her hands clasped just as they'd been found. When they finally began to remove the resin, it was with tools smaller than dental picks. Millimeter by millimeter, they chipped away at each layer, some hard and brittle, others still tacky near the surface. It was painstaking work, more like archaeology than autopsy. After nearly 2 days of this, they revealed her face. I wasn't in the room then, but I heard the stillness afterward. No chatter, no technical jargon, just the slow, heavy silence of realization. Her teeth matched perfectly with her dental records. Caroline was finally identified. When Miles called the Fosters, I sat across from him in his office. He didn't put it on speaker. I could hear Sarah's voice break once, then nothing but the faint hum of the line. David didn't speak at all. That sound, the kind where grief sits in the throat but can't find its way out, has stayed with me more than any scream ever could. In the following days, the lab's findings painted a picture so methodical it was almost incomprehensible. The resin wasn't industrial. It was natural pine and fir collected and layered over years. Each coat contained traces of pollen from different seasons, as if someone had been returning periodically to apply it. The oldest layers dated back to the autumn Caroline vanished. The newest carried pollen from that same spring only weeks before the discovery. Whoever had done this had cared for the site like a shrine, revisiting it season after season, sealing her further into the forest until she became part of it. When the final layers were gone and the autopsy began, the truth of her death was mercifully simple and cruel strangulation, a narrow groove circling her neck, the imprint of leather pressed deep into the skin. The hyoid bone was fractured. No signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds. Just one act, deliberate and silent. It suggested she'd been taken by surprise, or she'd trusted whoever did it enough not to resist. Her socks were still on, but her shoes were missing. That detail stuck with me. There was something strangely intimate about it, like someone had stripped away the last symbol of travel, as if to say, "You won't be walking away from here." The sheriff's office held a press conference a week later. Cameras flashed, reporters filled the small room, and Miles stood at the podium with a face carved from stone. He confirmed that the remains were Caroline's, that her death had been ruled a homicide, but avoided mention of the altar or the ritual details. The public didn't need to know that yet. What mattered was that a family finally had an answer, even if it wasn't the kind they wanted. I stayed in the back, watching the way the flashes washed over his uniform, the brief bursts of white light reflecting in his eyes. Behind him on the wall hung a framed map of the park, the same one I'd traced with my finger 2 years earlier. It was strange to think how small that ravine looked on paper, how harmless, how easy it was to miss a place where something so deliberate had been happening all along. After the conference, I drove out past the edge of town, following the old road that runs alongside the river. I parked by the overlook and sat there until the light went down. I thought about the man who'd done this, how he'd moved through those woods undetected for years, building something monstrous in plain silence. He knew the terrain better than anyone. He knew where to hide, when to come back, how to disappear again without leaving a single footprint that survived the seasons. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was devotion warped and patient, a kind of faith, maybe the worst kind. In the weeks that followed, the investigation consumed the park. The FBI sent behavioral analysts who studied the altar, the carvings, the resin. Their profiles all circled the same conclusion: a male, older, solitary someone who believed he was protecting something sacred. They used phrases like territorial fixation and ritual preservation. But under all that clinical language was the same human truth: someone had turned grief, anger, or madness into ceremony. Miles asked me to consult when they began cross-referencing old ranger reports, anything mentioning hermits or squatters in the park. We spent late nights going through yellowed pages, incident logs, handwritten notes. Somewhere in there we hoped was the ghost we were chasing. I remember one entry from the early 90s filed by a retired ranger named Holloway. He'd written about a man living illegally on park land, wearing handmade clothes, avoiding contact. Holloway described him as wary, watchful, carving marks into trees. When Miles read that line aloud, the room went still. It was the first time anything tied the symbols at the altar to a living person. Holloway couldn't remember his name, only that he'd seen him near Porter Creek, about 10 miles from where Caroline's body was found. The man had vanished soon after those encounters, leaving behind nothing but the faint rumor of a cabin no one could locate again. That was the lead that cracked the silence open. Within days, a team organized a quiet expedition, keeping it off the record. They invited me to come along, not as law enforcement, just as someone who knew the land. I agreed. It felt less like a choice and more like an obligation. If the mountains had swallowed Caroline once, maybe they were ready to spit out the man who'd taken her. We left before dawn, 4 of us and Holloway, as our guide, following narrow deer trails and half-forgotten cuts in the slope. The air had that thin, brittle cold that turns every sound sharp. Around midday, we stumbled upon what looked like a mound of collapsed timber pressed against the side of a rocky bluff. Up close, it wasn't just debris, it was a shelter. A crude hut, logs sealed with clay and moss roof sagging under decades of rot. We crouched in the doorway, flashlights cutting through the dark. The air inside was heavy stale, carrying the faint scent of pine resin. There on the inner wall, carved with startling precision, was the same circle and cross pattern we'd found on the trees near the altar. a dozen of them varying in size, etched deep into the grain. I remember the sound my breath made against the mask, how loud it seemed in that little room. We found tools next in old handsaw knives with handles made from deer antlers, a few pots hardened with residue that looked eerily familiar. Holloway ran his fingers over the rim of one, then glanced back at me. "Sap," he said quietly. He was collecting sap. We worked in silence for hours, cataloging, photographing. Every item we pulled from that place felt like it belonged to another century, primitive, handmade, deliberate. But the strangest thing was how long it had been abandoned. Dust thick enough to dull every surface. Cobwebs lacing the corners. Whoever had lived there hadn't been back in years. And yet less than a year earlier, someone had been layering resin over Caroline's body season after season. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest as we hiked back out. Maybe he'd built another shelter deeper still. Maybe he'd left and returned in cycles, tied to something only he understood. Or maybe, like the mountains themselves, he was both present and hidden, living somewhere between the seen and the lost. When we reached the trucks, Miles looked at me and said, "We've got his handprints all over this." I nodded, but part of me wondered if we'd really found anything at all. The man who'd built that hut had lived his life like a ghost, and now the more we uncovered, the more it felt like he wanted us to see only what he'd chosen to leave behind. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of those carvings glowed behind my eyelids, the same pattern repeating over and over, perfect circles intersected by crosses like coordinates marking a path that didn't exist. Somewhere out there in those same dark woods was the answer. Whether he was dead hiding or something in between, I didn't know. But I could feel the weight of his silence pressing down over that forest again, thick as the resin that once sealed her away. And for the first time in years, I realized the search hadn't really ended. It had just changed shape. When we got back from Porter Creek that night, the forest still clung to me, the damp smell of earth, the way the air pressed down as if the trees were holding secrets. I remember sitting in my truck with the heater humming, staring at my hands. Dirt under the nails, resin stains on the gloves, fragments of bark in the cuffs of my jacket. You tell yourself you've seen it all, that no new form of darkness can surprise you. Then you walk into a room carved into the side of a hill and realize someone's been living outside of time, marking his walls with symbols only he could understand. The lab would take weeks to process what we'd collected from the hut hair samples. Bits of hardened sap, the old saw the knives with antler handles. But even that night I knew. Whoever had built that place was the same man who'd sealed Caroline Foster into her amber tomb. The question wasn't whether he'd done it. It was who he'd been and how long he'd managed to disappear. We met in the sheriff's office the next morning, a small room that smelled like old coffee and wet paper. Miles had been up all night writing his report, his shirt still creased from the day before. He looked at me over his glasses. "We've got him," he said, then hesitated. "Or we've got what's left of him." The words hung there between us. He meant that we had everything but a living man. The DNA they pulled from the hairs in that sleeping cot didn't match anything in the system, not a prison record, not a draft card, not a single government file. Whoever he was, he'd never existed on paper. Miles leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused. "You ever think he said that some people are born to be forgotten?" I didn't answer. I'd seen what forgetting could do to the living. Weeks went by. We waited for lab results for any lead that could turn a ghost into a name. The press lost interest. The tourists came back to the park. By September, the trees started turning, and the case began to feel like one of those old stories that locals whisper about but never finish. Then one afternoon, Miles called me back to the office. He had that look again, the one that says he's about to hand you something heavy. An archivist from a neighboring county had read about the case in a small-town newspaper. The article mentioned Porter Creek, the search for a long-vanished hermit, and that word, altar. The archivist had called the sheriff directly, said he might know something about the land itself, long before it became part of the park. We drove out to meet him at a county records building that smelled of mildew and ink. The man was in his 70s, thin as kindling, with reading glasses perched halfway down his nose. He led us through rows of files and laid a faded map across the table. "This stretch here," he said, pointing to the very ground where we'd found the hut, used to belong to the Raines family. Settlers. Been there since the 1800s. He told us how the government had bought up land in the 1930s to create the park, forcing dozens of families off their property. Most took the money and left. One didn't. The Raines family fought the eviction for years, calling the land sacred, a place of birth and burial that no outsider had the right to claim. They lost the fight, but not before the father swore that one of his own would return. The archivist looked at us over the rims of his glasses and said, "Some folks around here say he did." That night I sat at my kitchen table with a photocopy of that map. The ink was faint, the edges browned. I traced the line of Porter Creek with my thumb and wondered if the man we were chasing was one of those descendants, someone born into that bitterness, raised on stories of betrayal. It wasn't hard to imagine a life folding in on itself up there, cut off from the rest of the world, until nothing made sense but the trees and the old anger buried beneath them. Miles had a theory. He wasn't killing for pleasure, he said. He was performing a ritual, preserving her, making her part of the land he thought was his. I wanted to argue, but he was right. There was too much patience in what he'd done, too much care. Whatever it wasn't random. By October, we'd tracked down one living relative of the Raines family, a great-nephew living in North Carolina. He was an older man, mid-60s, quiet and polite when we arrived at his small farmhouse. When we explained why we were there, his face changed, not surprise, but something closer to resignation, like he'd been waiting for this visit without knowing it. "You're talking about my great-uncle, aren't you?" he said. "Luther Raines." He told us Luther had been born in 1928, grew up on the same mountain his family lost, and never forgave the world for taking it. He'd lived with relatives for a time, then one day just left. "Said he was going home," the man said, eyes distant. Nobody saw him again after that. He went to a drawer and brought back a photograph, black and white edges curling. A young man standing in front of a log cabin, eyes sharp and unyielding. The gaze was unmistakable. Even in that faded print you could feel the weight of him, like he was daring the camera to blink first. We asked if he'd be willing to give a DNA sample for comparison. He agreed without hesitation, though I could tell it cost him something. "If it helps put it to rest," he said quietly, "then take it." A month later, the results came back, a familial match, clear as daylight. The man who'd lived and died in those mountains was a Raines, the last of a line that refused to leave. Suddenly, everything we'd seen made a grim kind of sense. The altar, the resin, the carvings. It wasn't madness, not in the way people like to label things they can't explain. It was devotion passed down and warped over generations. To him, Caroline had trespassed into something sacred. And what he'd done preserving her in resin, visiting her season after season, wasn't desecration in his mind. It was offering. A twisted attempt to return what was taken, to bind her spirit to the same soil he believed his blood had consecrated. I remember sitting in Miles's office when the final report came through. He'd poured 2 cups of coffee, but neither of us touched them. The conclusion was simple and terrible. The killer was likely dead. Old age, illness, exposure, take your pick. The last layer of resin on Caroline's body was from the spring of 2000, which meant he'd lived long enough to finish his ritual, but not long enough to see her found. "He died out there," Miles said, "probably close by. The forest took him the same way it took her." I nodded, though it didn't feel like agreement. I thought about the hut, the dust on everything, how empty it had felt, as if the man had stepped outside one day and simply never come back. Maybe that's what he wanted to dissolve back into the land he'd worshipped. No marker, no name. We closed the case officially in early 2002. The paperwork called it solved under exceptional circumstances. I suppose that was the cleanest way to write the truth that justice had no one left to punish. When the press release went out, I drove back to see the Fosters one last time. Their house looked the same, though quieter somehow. Sarah met me at the door. Her hair had gone gray around the temples, but her eyes were steady. She already knew, of course. The sheriff had called earlier that morning. They said it's over, she told me. But it doesn't feel like over. David stood by the kitchen window looking out toward the yard where Caroline's wind chime still hung motionless in the still air. You did what you could, he said. I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that we'd never really caught the man, only the ghost he left behind, but I couldn't make the words come out. Some things you just let sit in the air between you unspoken. When I left their house that afternoon, the mountains looked different, darker somehow, though the sun was shining. I drove out to a turnout where you could see the ridges rolling like waves into the horizon. The air was cool and clear, the kind of air Caroline would have loved. I thought about how much of that forest still remains untouched. How many places exist that no map or satellite can ever truly find. And I wondered how long the past can live in a place before it starts shaping the present again. There's a reason the locals say the Smokies don't forget. Everything that goes missing there stays in one form or another. As dusk settled, I caught sight of something across the ridge, just a shape, maybe a stump or a shadow. But for a moment it looked like a man standing among the trees watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, but part of me knew better. The forest doesn't give up its ghosts that easily. Not the ones made of blood, and not the ones made of memory. When I started the truck and turned back toward town, the sky had gone the color of burnt amber, the same shade that had sealed Caroline into that resin cocoon. It spread over the ridges in slow bands of light until the whole mountain seemed to glow from within. I thought about the years he'd spent layering that resin one season at a time, patient as the trees themselves. And somewhere between those layers of sap and silence, I realized he'd built something that outlasted him, a shrine, a warning, maybe both. I rolled down the window and let the wind carry the pine scent into the cab. Beneath it, faint but clear, was the sound of the forest breathing steady and unhurried, as if it knew the story wasn't done. There was still one piece missing, one question that refused to settle. And deep down, I knew the mountain still held the answer. After the case was closed, it didn't feel like an ending, more like a kind of settling, the way dust hangs in the air after a collapse before it finally drifts down. The paperwork said solved under exceptional circumstances, but that never sat right with me. Solved implies a clean line between what happened and what didn't, and nothing about that mountain or what it kept was ever clean. The world moved on, as it always does. But those of us who lived through it carried the silence in different ways. For the Fosters, it meant learning to live beside an absence instead of fighting it. For me, it meant trying to understand what kind of faith could twist a man so far from the rest of humanity that he thought mummifying a girl in sap was a holy act. The day after the official closure, I drove back into the park alone. It was late winter, the kind where the light feels thin and the trees stand naked against the cold sky. The gates were open, but few tourists bothered that time of year. I followed the road as far as they'd let the public go and parked by the river. The air smelled of wood smoke from some distant cabin maybe miles away. I walked until I reached a ridge high enough to see the folds of the land in every direction, miles of forest and mist green fading to gray. Somewhere out there was the ravine where we found her, now sealed off and reclaimed by time. The rangers had dismantled the altar, hauled it out piece by piece, and the soil had been turned over to break any trace of what happened there. But even if you erased every mark, it didn't matter. You could still feel the weight of that place in the air, like the land itself remembered. I stood there a long while thinking about Caroline, about how she'd loved this park, how the same trees that once gave her peace had become her grave. I thought, too, about the man who killed her, how he'd grown up believing those woods were his inheritance, the one thing his bloodline still owned after the world took everything else. There's a kind of poison in that kind of thinking, a slow rot that turns reverence into possession. He wasn't crazy in the way people mean when they say that word. He was faithful just to the wrong God. And I think he believed down to his final breath that what he did was righteous, that he wasn't killing her, but binding her to the earth she trespassed on. I didn't tell the Fosters that part. They'd already borne more than enough truth. What they needed, what they deserved, was peace. When I visited them again that spring, their house looked lighter somehow. Sarah had started gardening again, rows of lavender and sage along the back fence. David still worked long hours, but he'd stopped avoiding the porch at dusk. They'd turned Caroline's room into a small study, though they kept one shelf of her books untouched. She used to mark the ones she liked with leaves, Sarah said, running her finger along the spines. Sure enough, pressed between the pages were brittle pieces of oak and pine souvenirs from hikes she never got to finish. It was the quietest act of remembrance I'd ever seen. They invited me to a memorial service the park organized that summer, a small gathering near Alum Cave Trail, where Caroline had started her hike 12 years before. There were maybe 30 people there, family friends, a few rangers who'd worked the case. The trailhead looked almost the same wooden sign, the same smell of pine needles baking in the sun, but I couldn't look at it the same way. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper, and every so often a leaf would drift down slow, the way resin might have fallen drop by drop over those long-lost years. When Sarah spoke, her voice didn't shake. This place was her joy, she said. And that's how we'll remember it. That simple. No anger, no vengeance. Just love enduring where the world had tried to erase it. Afterward, I stayed behind a while. The sun dipped low and the shadows grew long across the trail. For the first time in years, I let myself walk a short way up it. The dirt crunched underfoot, the air cool but forgiving. About half a mile in, I stopped and turned back toward the valley. The world stretched out below, blue and endless, and for a brief moment it felt like Caroline had finally been returned to the peace she sought that morning. I think that's when it hit me, the truth that closure isn't justice. It's not a verdict, not a headline, not even an answer. It's the point when you accept that the story has already taken what it came to take, and the only thing left to do is remember. As for Miles, he retired not long after. The case took more out of him than he admitted at the time. We kept in touch for a while, trading short calls on anniversaries of the discovery, both of us pretending those check-ins were just habit. But we both knew we were keeping the story alive in our own way, refusing to let it fade into another cold file gathering dust in an archive. I think that's what drives people like us. We spend our lives chasing truth not because it changes the outcome, but because naming what happened feels like the only form of respect left to give. Every now and then I still get letters. Folks who've heard the story or read about it online asking if it's true, if the forest really hides that kind of horror. I tell them the same thing every time: the mountains hold everything, beauty, tragedy, memory. They don't choose what to keep, and that's what makes them sacred. It's easy to think of nature as pure, as something separate from us, but it's not. The forest only reflects what we bring into it. Caroline brought curiosity and wonder. He brought bitterness and fear. Both of them remain there in some way, woven into the soil, indistinguishable now from the roots. Sometimes when I drive through the Smokies at dusk, I catch myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see a flicker of movement, just the play of light maybe, or a deer slipping between shadows. But every so often it feels like something else, something older watching back. I don't mean ghosts, not in the storybook sense. I mean memory, the kind that lives in places where the human and the wild have blurred too long to tell apart. Maybe that's what haunts us about this story. It's not the evil of one man or the suffering of one family. It's the reminder that the line between the two isn't as wide as we'd like to believe. The last time I spoke to Sarah was 2 years ago. She said they'd donated Caroline's camera to a small museum in Knoxville, part of an exhibit about the history of the park. The roll of film was still inside, never developed. We decided to leave it that way, she said. It feels right. Like her last moment should stay untouched. I understood. Some things aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to be carried quietly the way mountains carry their dead, without spectacle, without end. That night, after hanging up, I sat outside on my porch. The air smelled of rain and distant pine, and a soft wind moved through the yard. It sounded almost like breathing. I thought about Caroline, about the years lost. The lives changed the way time folds over itself until the past feels closer than it should. And I realized that stories like this never really end. They settle the way resin does, layer upon layer, hardening around the truth, until all that's left is the shape of what once was. We look at it, we study it, we try to understand it, but deep down we know we never will. All we can do is remember. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for the shock of it, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because the worst thing time can do to a tragedy isn't keep it alive, it's let it fade.